reason for why the Supreme Court of the United States has struck down President Trump's ability to use tariffs. IEPA, they say, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, does not authorize the president to impose tariffs. This is a judgment from the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, John Roberts. I'm reading through this decision right now, which just came out literally in the last couple of moments here about the president's tariff authority. Worth noting that this is coming out just before he's set to go in front, of course, of Congress, a joint meeting of Congress, to talk to Democrats and Republicans. He has been touting tariffs constantly. Okay, now I have a good idea of who has joined this opinion. Roberts, the Chief Justice of the court, has delivered the judgment of the court.
All right, people, welcome back. Adam is here. So this is happening. The Supreme Court ruled 6-3 that Trump's sweeping tariff authority was never legally valid, throwing $130 billion in collected tariff revenue into legal limbo. Trump responded by calling the justices a disgrace and claiming the ruling proved his power, revealing a massive gap between his public spin and the devastating legal reality.
A multi-billion-dollar setback for the Trump administration this afternoon.
A federal judge has cleared the way for thousands of businesses to receive refunds for those tariffs. Fox business correspondent Lydia Hu has the details.
Federal judge has ordered the administration to begin refunding billions of dollars in tariffs. More than 2,000 companies have filed lawsuits seeking refunds, according to reports, and many of them are big businesses like Costco and FedEx looking to benefit from the tariff challenges initiated by small businesses. The federal judge's order comes after the Supreme Court invalidated some of Trump's tariff powers last month. The order directs U.S. Customs and Border Protection to begin recalculating duties importers paid and determine exactly how much money needs to be returned, on top of returning tariffs paid, where estimates range from $130 billion upwards of $175 billion.
Let me start with the actual documented facts of the Learning Resources ruling, because the foundation of this story is built on real Supreme Court jurisprudence documented by CNN, Time, the BBC, Reuters, and the New York Times in the most formally verified judicial reporting available. The court ruled 6-3. Chief Justice Roberts wrote the majority opinion. 2 Trump-appointed conservative justices joined the 3 liberal justices.
Roberts, the Chief Justice of the court, has delivered the judgment of the court. Also, Sonia Sotomayor, a liberal justice, Alana Kagan, another liberal justice, Neil Gorsuch, a conservative justice appointed by President Donald Trump, Amy Coney Barrett, another justice appointed by President Donald Trump, and Justice Jackson, as well, appointed by Joe Biden, joined that decision. Worth noting that the 2 dissenting judges, Clarence Thomas and Kavanaugh, along with Justice Alito, all dissented from that decision. So pretty fascinating stuff there. The Supreme Court striking down President Trump's tariff policy, something that is not only likely to get a very strong response, to say the least, from President Donald Trump.
The ruling specifically struck down Trump's emergency tariffs that covered nearly every country, including the reciprocal duties and the extra levies tied to the fentanyl crisis. It left in place only a narrow slice of more traditional trade measures. The specific legal basis for the ruling is the clear congressional authorization requirement that Roberts identified as the missing constitutional and statutory foundation for the sweeping unilateral tariff authority claim.
Now let's go live to CBS News White House correspondent Aaron Navarro. Aaron, this is a major defeat for President Trump. Have we heard from the president so far about how the Supreme Court ruled?
Mughal, we will hear a lot more from the president later this hour, as the White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt just announced on X that he will be holding his own press conference to talk about the tariff decision at 12:45 p.m. Eastern. You're seeing her tweet there. We're also getting some color. CBS News is learning from sources in the room and sources familiar on how the president found out about the ruling. The ruling came down during a closed-door meeting with governors of both parties from across the country in the White House. Sources told CBS News that President Trump was handed a note about the ruling, said to the governors that the ruling is a, quote, disgrace, said that he has a backup plan, and then left the room.
Those 3 words, clear congressional authorization, are the most consequential judicial phrase in the entire ruling, because they establish the constitutional principle that massive unilateral executive economic action requires explicit congressional approval, not just the most expansive reading of emergency statutory authority. The court rejected the administration's argument that the International Emergency Economic Powers Act gave the president authority to impose tariffs of any amount, any duration, and any form.
Foreign countries that have been ripping us off for years are ecstatic. They're so happy. And they're dancing in the streets, but they won't be dancing for long, that I can assure you. The Democrats on the court are thrilled, but they will automatically vote no. They're an automatic no, just like in Congress. They're an automatic no. They're against anything that makes America strong, healthy, and great again. They also are a, frankly, disgrace to our nation, those justices.
Chief Justice Roberts wrote that such a claim lacks the clear congressional authorization required by law. Any amount, any duration, any form. The most sweeping tariff authority claim rejected in the most categorical judicial language from the most authoritative constitutional institution. Now, let me talk about the president's response, because it is the most revealing part of this entire story. Trump rushed to the podium and claimed the ruling proves how powerful he is. He cherry-picked language from a dissenting opinion to argue that he can still impose much higher charges if he wants, and he branded the justices who ruled against him a disgrace to the nation. Here is why this response is so revealing. A president who responds to a Supreme Court ruling striking down his signature economic policy by claiming it proves his power is making the most dramatic alternative characterization of a judicial defeat imaginable. But the specific character of that response, cherry-picking a dissent to claim he can still impose higher tariffs while the majority ruling specifically rejected that authority, simultaneously and contradictorily reveals the internal acknowledgement that the majority opinion did not provide the support he is publicly claiming. You cannot simultaneously claim a ruling proves how powerful you are, and cherry-pick a dissent to find language suggesting you retain some authority without revealing that the majority opinion specifically rejected the authority you are claiming the ruling confirmed. Cherry-picking a dissent from a 6-3 ruling to find language supporting a position the six-justice majority specifically rejected is the most dramatically self-defeating public response to a judicial defeat possible. It most specifically and most publicly documents the acknowledgement that the majority opinion did not provide the support being publicly claimed. And then there is the disgrace to the nation characterization. We have documented the pattern before. When the president publicly attacks named judicial officers on the most amplified platform available, the result is measurable. Reuters documented more than 150 violent threat posts against named judges following specific public attacks. Now the president is branding Supreme Court justices a disgrace to the nation after they ruled against him in the most consequential economic policy case of his second term. That is the most dramatic escalation of the documented attack pattern from district and state court judges to the most senior federal judicial institution. Let me also highlight the framing that the businesses who sued the administration used, because it is the most historically resonant and democratically significant characterization of the constitutional violation at issue. The businesses that challenged the tariffs characterized Trump's unilateral tariff imposition as taxation without representation. That is the most foundational American democratic principle, reaching back to the pre-revolutionary accountability demands that birthed the nation. When businesses invoked that phrase, they were invoking the most foundational democratic accountability principle to most specifically and most formally characterize the constitutional violation at issue. The tariffs are taxes on imports paid by American businesses and consumers. The imposition of those taxes without the clear congressional authorization that the Roberts majority specifically required is the most direct modern expression of the foundational constitutional principle that taxes require democratic legislative approval rather than unilateral executive imposition. Taxation without representation is the most historically resonant and most democratically significant characterization of the constitutional violation, and its specific invocation by businesses that sued establishes the most democratically grounded constitutional accountability principle as the foundational basis for the most consequential judicial ruling of the entire second-term economic agenda. Now let me take you deeper into three specific dimensions of this ruling that each deserve careful attention. The first dimension is the $130 billion legal limbo. The second is the clear congressional authorization precedent. The third is the NUKE move analysis, and what the combination of these elements means for the broader accountability story. The $130 billion question is the most immediately practically consequential dimension of the tariff ruling. Understanding what happens to tariff revenue collected under tariffs that the Supreme Court has now specifically and formally determined were illegally imposed is the most consequential fiscal accountability context. The ruling strikes down the authority to impose the tariffs going forward. But the specific question of what happens to the revenue already collected under the illegally imposed tariffs is the most immediately and most practically consequential open legal question produced by the ruling. Businesses that paid tariffs under an authority that has now been specifically and formally ruled illegal have the most directly available legal argument for refunds of those payments. They were collected under tariff authority that the most authoritative constitutional institution has specifically determined was never lawfully exercised. The $130 billion figure represents the most immediately available fiscal consequence of that refund argument if it is pursued through the most available legal channels. That much money sitting in legal limbo is the most alarming fiscal uncertainty produced by the ruling, and its specific character as collected revenue whose legal basis has been specifically and formally rejected creates the most consequential fiscal accountability story of the second term. The International Emergency Economic Powers Act analysis is the specific statutory dimension that deserves careful treatment. The IEEPA gives the president specific authority to regulate international economic transactions in response to declared national emergencies. The Trump administration argued that IEEPA's emergency authority was broad enough to authorize sweeping global tariffs on virtually all imports from virtually all countries as an emergency economic measure. The Roberts majority specifically rejected that reading by applying the clear congressional authorization requirement to the IEEPA emergency tariff authority claim. The court found that the most sweeping unilateral tariff authority claim lacked the specific and explicit congressional authorization that massive executive economic action requires. The IEEPA limit is the most specifically consequential statutory interpretation. Its application of the clear congressional authorization requirement to emergency economic power claims most directly establishes the constitutional principle that will govern every future executive economic power claim. The second dimension is the clear congressional authorization precedent and what it means for future executive power battlegrounds. Analysts have specifically identified two areas as the next available legal battlegrounds, where this precedent will most directly constrain ambitious executive power claims. The first is the administration's attempt to influence Federal Reserve monetary policy through executive pressure. The Federal Reserve's independence from executive direction is specifically established by statute. Aggressive executive pressure on Federal Reserve interest rate decisions will most specifically require the clear congressional authorization that the Roberts majority determined is required for massive unilateral executive economic action. The second is the Birthright Citizenship Executive Order attempting to redefine the 14th Amendment Citizenship Clause through executive action. That order most directly and most specifically implicates the clear congressional authorization requirement because it attempts to override a constitutional amendment through executive order without any congressional authorization for that specific constitutional reinterpretation. Federal Reserve independence and birthright citizenship are the most specifically available next battlegrounds. The clear congressional authorization precedent established in the tariff ruling most directly and most formally positions both as candidates for the same categorical judicial rejection that the tariff authority claim received from the most cross-ideological available majority. The no more massive policy overhauls without Congress principle is the most broadly significant analytical conclusion from the tariff ruling. The New York Times 6 Takeaways analysis specifically identifies the ruling as establishing that the court will no longer greenlight emergency declarations when they involve massive policy overhauls that lack clear congressional authorization. That specific institutional signal is the most broadly consequential consequence of the tariff ruling beyond the specific IEEPA tariff authority question. It establishes the most formally available constitutional limit on the entire second-term strategy of using emergency declarations and executive orders to accomplish massive policy changes without going through the democratic legislative process. No more massive policy overhauls without Congress. That principle, established by a 6-3 cross-ideological majority, including Chief Justice Roberts and 2 Trump appointees, is the most formally available institutional signal that the ruling reflects rigorous bipartisan constitutional analysis rather than a politically divided judicial response. The third dimension is the ally and adversary reaction, which is the most internationally significant analytical context for the tariff ruling. Allies abroad specifically see the ruling as proof that American institutions can still rein in a rogue president. That specific characterization from foreign governments and international partners is the most directly available international institutional validation of the constitutional accountability story. It establishes that the Supreme Court's tariff ruling is being read by the most consequentially positioned international observers as proof of exactly the institutional resilience that the most alarming second-term executive overreach pattern was most specifically threatening. Allies seeing the ruling as proof that U.S. institutions can still rein in a rogue president is the most internationally significant consequence. Its specific character as the most consequentially positioned international institutional validation makes it the most broadly significant geopolitical dimension of the most consequential domestic constitutional accountability ruling of the entire second term. The $130 billion in tariff revenue now sitting in legal limbo following the 6-3 ruling striking down the tariff authority that generated it, most specifically establishes the most immediately and most practically consequential fiscal uncertainty of the entire second-term economic agenda. The taxation without representation characterization from businesses that sued most precisely identifies the most foundational democratic accountability principle as the constitutional basis for the most available refund claims. The fiscal limbo is the most practically consequential dimension, and the taxation without representation framing is the most historically resonant and democratically significant characterization of the constitutional violation. Chief Justice Roberts's clear congressional authorization requirement applied to IEEPA emergency tariff authority most precisely establishes the constitutional principle that will most directly govern every future second-term executive power claim, including Federal Reserve independence pressures and birthright citizenship executive orders. This makes the tariff ruling the most broadly consequential constitutional precedent for the entire remaining second-term legal battleground beyond the specific IEEPA tariff authority question. Clear congressional authorization most specifically established. IEEPA limits most formally determined. Federal Reserve and birthright citizenship most directly implicated as next battlegrounds. The NUKE move characterization most analytically accurately describes the combined impact of the any amount, any duration, any form, categorical rejection, the $130 billion fiscal limbo, the clear congressional authorization precedent covering all future executive economic power claims, and the declaration of independence institutional signal from a 6-3 cross-ideological majority. Together, these elements most specifically and most formally collapse the most central pillar of the second-term economic agenda, while establishing the most broadly available constitutional constraint on every remaining executive power claim simultaneously. The NUKE move characterization is the most analytically accurate description because its specific combination of immediate fiscal consequence, constitutional precedent, and institutional signal makes it the most comprehensively available judicial accountability development of the entire second term. Here is exactly what you need to watch as the tariff ruling continues to produce its most consequential outcomes. Watch the tariff revenue refund litigation for any indication that businesses are pursuing refund claims for the $130 billion collected under authority the ruling determined was never lawfully exercised. Watch the administration's alternative tariff strategy for any indication that the president is pursuing other ways to hammer imports without going through Congress, testing the clear congressional authorization precedent against alternative tariff mechanisms. Watch the Federal Reserve and birthright citizenship litigation for any indication that courts are applying the clear congressional authorization precedent to those executive power claims, signaling how broadly the tariff ruling's constitutional constraint is being extended. And watch the midterm electoral landscape for any signals that the ruling's undercutting of the tariffs make us rich message is producing electoral consequences for GOP incumbents who sold voters on that narrative. Let me leave you with the absolute bottom line. The Supreme Court ruled 6-3 in Learning Resources Incorporated versus Trump that the president lacked the authority under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act to impose sweeping global tariffs covering nearly every country. The most sweeping unilateral tariff authority claim lacked the clear congressional authorization required by law, according to Chief Justice Roberts writing for the majority. More than $130 billion in collected tariff revenue is now sitting in legal limbo following the ruling striking down the authority that generated it. The president rushed to the podium claiming the ruling proves how powerful he is, while cherry-picking a dissent and simultaneously branding the ruling justices a disgrace to the nation. That is the most dramatically contradictory and most specifically revealing presidential reaction to the most consequential judicial defeat of the second term. The taxation without representation characterization from businesses that sued invokes the most foundational democratic accountability principle as the constitutional basis for the most available refund arguments. The clear congressional authorization precedent most directly constrains Federal Reserve independence pressures and birthright citizenship executive orders as the next available legal battlegrounds. And allies abroad specifically see the ruling as proof that American institutions can still rein in a rogue president, the most internationally significant institutional validation of the domestic constitutional accountability story. The ruling is documented by CNN, Time, the BBC, Reuters, and the New York Times. The $130 billion fiscal limbo is real. The clear congressional authorization precedent is formally established. The Declaration of Independence institutional signal is the most formally available evidence that even a court reshaped by the president's own appointments will draw constitutional lines when he pushes too far. The NUKE move characterization is the most analytically accurate description of what happens when the most consequential constitutional institution unanimously and cross-ideologically rejects the most central pillar of the most ambitious second-term economic power strategy. We are going to be right here watching every single development as the tariff ruling continues to produce its most consequential fiscal, constitutional, and electoral outcomes. Drop a comment below and tell me what you think. Does the clear congressional authorization precedent from the tariff ruling expand to constrain the most aggressive remaining second-term executive power claims across the Federal Reserve, birthright citizenship, and other battlegrounds? Or does the administration find alternative legal frameworks that navigate the constitutional constraint below the threshold where additional judicial corrections are required? I want to hear from you. I will see you in the next one.